What if surviving a winter of 30 degrees below zero had nothing to do with making more heat, and everything to do with never letting it escape? Picture it for a moment. The breath freezes the instant it leaves your lips. The wind moves across endless snow like something alive, searching for any warmth it can steal. And yet, somewhere inside a shelter made of hides and bent wood, a child sleeps soundly, wrapped in a warmth that should not exist. Across the frozen plains of North America, winter was never just a season. It was a silent predator, patient and relentless, waiting for the smallest mistake. By every modern standard, survival in a place like this should have been nearly impossible. And still, for thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of this land did not merely endure these winters. They mastered them, without central heating, without factories, sometimes without a single tree in sight to burn. Here is where their story becomes almost unbelievable, because they lived by a principle that sounds impossible to us today, a principle that had almost nothing to do with fire. Hold on to that thought, because everything you are about to see leads back to it. Most of us fight the cold the way our modern world always does, with more fuel, bigger heaters, thicker walls, always producing, always burning. These ancient peoples did the opposite. They understood something we have quietly forgotten, that the most powerful insulator on Earth is not stone, not wool, not wood. It is air. Still, trapped, silent air. They did not fight nature with force. They learned to read it, to listen to its laws, and to turn those laws into survival. And some of the materials they trusted their lives to might surprise you, because one of the most powerful insulators they ever found grew quietly along the edges of rivers and wetlands. It was the cattail, a common marsh plant that most people would walk right past. In late autumn, its seed heads burst open into clouds of soft fibers that drift through the air like cotton, delicate enough to vanish on a breeze. Yet inside that fragile fluff hides a quiet secret. Every single fiber traps tiny pockets of still air, and when it is packed into clothing or stuffed into boots, it becomes a shield against the cold that is astonishingly warm and almost weightless. Dry grasses and moss did the same silent work, their hollow stems holding thousands of microscopic chambers of air, slowing the escape of heat and blocking the cold from creeping in. These materials needed no factories and no tools, only knowledge, only a people who had watched the land long enough to understand its gifts. But insulation alone could never defeat a winter this brutal. To truly survive, the shelter itself had to become a machine. To modernize, the tipi can look almost primitive, just a circle of wooden poles wrapped in animal hides, with a small fire glowing inside. Yet this simple shape was one of the most efficient winter shelters ever built for the open plains. Its cone let the screaming prairie winds glide smoothly around it, instead of slamming into flat walls, so even violent storms often slipped past as if the shelter were barely there. But the real genius was hidden inside. A second lining of hides hung along the walls, leaving a narrow gap between the outer skin and the living space, and through that gap cold air rose slowly, warming as it climbed, mixing with the heat of the fire before it ever reached the family. Smoke escaped through an adjustable opening at the top, guided by flaps that shifted with the wind. Inside, a mother could hold her child and listen to the blizzard roar against the hides, while the air around them stayed calm and warm. This was no mere tent. It was a thermal machine, breathing with the storm. But the people of the open plains were not the only masters of winter, because, far to the east, deep in the frozen forests of the north, another culture faced the same brutal cold and answered it with something extraordinary. They built the longhouse, a wooden structure that could stretch more than 60 meters from end to end, so long that walking through it felt like passing through a tunnel carved out of the forest itself. This was no ordinary home. It was an entire community gathered beneath a single roof, dozens of families, sometimes more than 100 people, living side by side through the darkest months of the year. Its frame was made of young, flexible trees bent into wide arches and covered in overlapping sheets of bark, strong enough to carry the crushing weight of snow, warm enough to hold a whole village inside. Hearth fires burned in a line down the central corridor, and their warmth rose toward the high roof while sleeping platforms lifted the people above the cold that pooled along the ground. Yet here is the part that almost no one expects, because inside that long wooden hall, the greatest source of heat was never the fire at all. It was the people themselves. Every human body quietly radiates warmth, a resting adult giving off roughly 100 watts of heat without even trying. Now gather 100 of them under one roof, and you have nearly 10,000 watts of living warmth, glowing softly through the night, body beside body, breath beside breath, life, warming life. The very old and the very young were given the warmest places, cradled in the heart of the shelter, while the food stores and stacked firewood lining the walls soaked up heat through the day and released it slowly after dark, so the whole building seemed to breathe in one long, shared rhythm. And the same wisdom shaped the clothing they wore, layer upon careful layer, each one trapping a cushion of still air. Against the skin went soft deer hide, tanned until it moved like cloth and pulled moisture away so sweat would never freeze. Over that came a looser layer holding its own pocket of warmth, and above it all, a robe of bison hide worn with the thick fur turned inward while the leather outside blocked the wind. Even their moccasins were made a little too large, left roomy on purpose so dry grass and fur could be packed inside, and their mittens kept the fingers together rather than apart, because warmth, they understood, was something you never let slip away. Yet warmth and shelter still left one question unanswered, a question that could mean the difference between life and death on the open plains. Where did the fire come from? Picture the grasslands in the depth of winter, a horizon stretching in every direction with not a single tree in sight, nothing to cut, nothing to burn. And in that emptiness, the people found their fuel in the most unexpected place of all. The great bison herds that once thundered across these plains, millions of animals moving like a living tide, gave the people not only food and hides, but something just as vital when the cold came, their dung, dried by sun and wind through the warmer months. It hardened into what the plains tribes called buffalo chips, a fuel that burned slow and steady with almost no smoke, often the only thing that stood between a family and the freezing dark. They gathered it and stored it carefully all year long, and a single small pile could keep a fire alive for hours. To an outsider, the idea might sound unpleasant, yet the smoke carried a scent closer to dry grass or peat, and to those who lived there, it was simply the smell of home. But the plains held one final secret, and it came from the very thing that everyone feared the most: snow. To anyone unfamiliar with the cold, snow seems like the enemy of all warmth, and yet fresh snow can be nearly 90% air, which makes it one of the finest insulators in all of nature. The people understood this deeply. They piled snow around the base of their shelters to seal every gap and break the wind, and the deeper the drift grew, the warmer the world became inside. In some places, they dug down into the earth itself, raising wooden frames and burying them beneath thick layers of soil and snow, and within those half-buried shelters, the air could hold near freezing, even as the outside world plunged to 30 below. The enemy and the savior, it turned out, were often the very same thing. It only depended on how you chose to see it. And when night finally fell, and the fires burned low, survival came down to the smallest details of how people lived inside these shelters. Beds were built in careful layers. First a bed of spruce branches or dry grass lifted above the cold floor, then thick hides, then soft furs piled on top, and people slept close together, sharing the warmth of their own bodies through the long darkness. Sometimes stones were heated in the fire, wrapped in hide, and tucked near the bedding to release their warmth slowly until morning. And what they ate mattered just as much, for winter food was rich in fat and protein, none more famous than pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, so full of energy that it seemed to light a fire inside the body itself. Shelter, clothing, fuel, and food, all of it woven into a single system built to hold on to every trace of warmth. But now we come back to that impossible principle, the one I promised you at the very beginning, the one that had almost nothing to do with fire, because the deepest secret of these people was never a material or a shelter at all. It was a way of seeing. To them, winter was never an enemy to be defeated. It was simply part of the natural rhythm of life. Summer was the season of movement and hunting and gathering, and winter became the season of something quieter and just as vital, of storytelling, of making tools, of elders passing their knowledge into younger hands around a glowing fire. Never waste heat, they seemed to say, but what they truly meant ran deeper. Never waste anything, not the land, not the time, and above all, not each other. Their survival was never built on conquering nature, but on belonging to it. And perhaps that is the question worth carrying with us long after this story ends. Somewhere along the way, In all our warmth and all our comfort, when exactly did we forget how to keep each other warm? If stories like this stay with you, this is where they live, here on Shadows of Valhalla, where the oldest wisdom still holds the greatest power.